Hi, this is Rob Bryanton from Imagining the 10th Dimension. We're about to listen to an interview with me that was conducted in November 2007 by Tom Huston, one of the editors of What is Enlightenment magazine, which is now known as EnlightenNext. This interview was originally intended for this magazine's WIE Unbound website, but unfortunately it was the feeling of the WIE Unbound team that their audience would find it too difficult to follow this conversation if they weren't already familiar with my 10th Dimension project. I'd like to thank the publishers of EnlightenNext, who have now granted me permission to release this interview. So now, here's Tom Huston.
I'm speaking this morning with Rob Bryanton, who is a musician, producer, and the president of Talking Dog Studios in Saskatchewan, Canada, which is an audio post-production facility specializing in music for film and TV. One of their recent projects was creating the music and sound for the upcoming film Surveillance, co-written and directed by David Lynch's daughter, Jennifer Lynch. But music isn't Rob's only interest. He is also the author of Imagining the 10th Dimension, a new way of thinking about time and space. His website, 10thdimension.com, hosts an 11-minute flash animation of his 10-dimensional model of reality. I recently wrote an article about his work titled Your 3D Universe is So Passé, which appeared in our Utopia issue 36, a few months ago. Rob, thanks for speaking with me. And
thank you very much.
I was wondering if you could start off by giving me a little background on how you came up with your 10-dimensional model.
I have to say, when I first came up with it, it was definitely just an intuitive leap that I made. I was, at the time, actually working with a playwright on a science fiction play that I was writing the music for, and that was 20 years ago. And so I tried to convince the playwright that this would be a good idea to incorporate my way of imagining the dimensions into this play that was placed at the end times of Earth 20,000 years in the future. And I just couldn't convince him. So I spent the next 20 years talking to people about this way of imagining the dimensions, and then as string theory came along and, other ways of thinking about reality related to quantum physics and those sorts of ideas started to be introduced to me, I went, wait, my way of imagining the dimensions fits with all that, and I became more and more fascinated at all the different ways I could see the connections. That's how I ended up creating this project.
And you had written that the model came about in relation to a number of songs you were creating?
I had written about 40 songs, but in the course of reading about all the dimensional models that are out there, I discovered that 26 had been a magic number that was used by string theory for a number of years. It fell out of fashion, but as I was creating the book, I decided, well, just for a little bit of an in-joke, I'll choose 26 of my favorite songs from that, and I'll add those as an addendum to the project. And that's actually one of the things that has taken me a lot longer than I thought it was going to, was getting good recordings of those 26 songs at the same time that this is basically just a hobby project for me, and I continue to run a successful audio post-production facility and be working on composing music for films and television. So the 26 songs are just finally to the point now where I've been able to play everybody all 26 songs, and I've created videos for pretty well all of them now. And those 26 songs talk about different aspects of the ideas behind my way of imagining the dimensions, which is, such a large idea. It's not just about saying 10 dimensions of reality are related to string theory. There's all these other ideas of memes and the way that ideas and creativity connect across time and space and connect us all together, which is, I think probably one of the things that your readers will see, when they work through my way of imagining the dimensions. There's so many connections to those schools of thought that work, coincidentally or not, they work really well. And that's one of the things that's been so astonishing to me, is the number of people coming from different schools of thought saying, what you've shown me works for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely one of the more fascinating. That was what struck me when I first visited your website and entered the discussion forums, seeing just how much your model was making sense to people of everything, from paranormal phenomena to different spiritual beliefs and metaphysical models, and it also had many correlations to ideas currently in vogue in physics.
I think it's like everybody comes to the party with their own little piece of the puzzle, and my piece of the puzzle is I've shown people a way to imagine this really big picture that is the underlying structure of reality. And I'm no expert on, the math that goes into creating string theory, or I'm no expert on Kabbalah, for instance, which people are constantly bringing up as, look at all the connections between what Rob Bryanton has showed us and this school of thought, Mm-hmm. But what I have come with is this visualization tool that everybody, once they've worked through that animation, sure, there's lots of people that go, doesn't work for me, I don't get it, but there's many more people out there who go, my mind has just been blown. I have just seen what they're talking about when they talk about, the really big picture of what is behind it all.
Mm-hmm. For those listening to this who haven't actually seen the model and watched the flash video that lays it all out, it's probably hard to grasp what we're talking about. Is there a way in which you could kind of give a brief overview of what the model is or how it works in a way that would actually be for those who don't have a visual aid handy at the moment?
Well, first of all, this is where we start from, is that time is just another direction in space. And what that means then is that as you and I are in this version of reality right now, we're presented with a number of options that extend out from this moment in time forward, and actually from this moment in time backward too. But because we're in physical bodies, we look back in time and say, time is linear. There was only one way that we could have gotten to where we are right now. That's an illusion. The idea that time extending forward from now, there could only be one way too, I say also is an illusion, but of course there's the hard determinists out there that say everything's inevitable. Any idea that you have of your free will is just you acting out the script that was set in motion back at the beginning of the universe and will continue to the end of the universe. So what I've incorporated then is the idea that free will creates branches, and we are living in only one of those branches. That idea then gets extended up through the dimensions to show how we're locked in to a consensual reality, into a very locked-in set of physical constants that create the very specific universe that we're in. But with each dimension, we add another additional degree of freedom until we finally get to the 10th dimension, which is every possibility existing as potential only.
What do you mean by that?
Well, by the time, in the way of imagining the 10 dimensions that I've portrayed, by the time you reach the 10th dimension, you're in what quantum physicists talk about as the indeterminate quantum field, where when nothing is being observed, nothing is collapsed out. And so, as you rightfully pointed out, that idea ties into a lot of other ways of thinking about reality as well. But what's happening then for us is that we are observing certain subsets of all the dimensions that are locked in by various constructs that are happening in the dimensions above, and that's an idea that relates to memes and ways of organizing the data that is the information that becomes our reality, which is a quantum physics idea.
And there's something that struck me about your model, in that with each successive dimension, like the scale of reality gets magnified tremendously. We start off with the 4th dimension, which is a single cosmic timeline. Mm-hmm. And then the 5th dimension, that branches off into another. And suddenly we have more than one entire universal trajectory. And it just expands kind of exponentially from there until you get to the 10th dimension, which is every single possibility conceivable and then some. And
absolutely. And one of the things about it is that includes expressions of reality that are not physical, and that includes universes that couldn't possibly exist, that are only ideas, and that includes ways of organizing information that are related more to preferences, to the preference for creation over destruction, or something that people would think of as a spiritual organizing force as well.
I think listeners should definitely check out 10thdimension.com to actually walk through your very clear layout of the models here. They're at a computer, maybe they should stop right now and check it out so they can try to follow along.
And I have to say, that 11-minute animation is something that I played with for a long time. There's a lot of things incorporated into that animation in the way that it builds the ideas on top of each other, and actually the ways that it uses sound to help keep those ideas organized in your mind that are something that a lot of people who watch the animation remark upon is that by taking the ideas in a very specific order, it makes it a little easier for people to be able to comprehend what we're getting to by the time we get to that gigantic picture that we're at by the time we're in the 10th dimension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely true. It took me a few viewings to be able to begin to grasp it. But I wanted to talk to you about this, what you just mentioned in terms of determinism versus free will. And one of my favorite books of all time, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, deals with questions of morality, fate, and free will by using the idea of a higher dimension. There's a race of aliens called Tralfamadorians who abduct the main character and explain to him that they see all time as simultaneous, as we'd perceive a three-dimensional mountain range. Something static, unchanging, and already completed from beginning to end. And your model includes this idea that, as we mentioned before, that we could see this ourselves as being in a fourth-dimensional trajectory, a timeline that's kind of, in a sense, if you could step out and look at it, you would see that all time is already unfolded along that line. If I look behind me, there's my birth, ahead of me is my death, and I'm somewhere in between from my current vantage point.
Right, and that's the fourth dimensional perspective, which also relates to the idea that time is an illusion. And that's not something that just philosophers and mystics say, that's something that quantum physicists say as well. Time, as we experience it, is really not the whole picture.
And how do you reconcile that in your model and your way of thinking with the idea of free will?
Well, it's interesting. I think, one of the things that has happened just in the last couple of months is a proof that was published by a team of scientists at Oxford University under the direction of David Deutsch, a quantum physicist who has been one of the leading proponents of the multiverse idea for a number of years. And what they've done is equate the branching bush-like structure that's happening at the quantum level, where quantum states can exist simultaneously until they are observed. They're equating that with the bush-like branching structure of free will that we are moving through, that the idea that I walk out the front door and in one universe I turn left, and in another universe I turn right, and in the third universe I decide not to go out the door at all, and that all of those are equally real for the person who is within any one of those bush-like branching structures is what we're talking about by the time we get to the fifth dimension. And so if you're thinking of yourself as I call it in my animation, the long undulating snake that is you as a fourth dimensional object from your birth to your death, then to this moment in time, we look back and we see that there is only one part of the snake. But if you're really thinking about what's happening according to the David Deutsch proof that has now come out, then it's more like we're this long dandelion stalk up to this moment that we call now, and from there on, it's like a dandelion gone to seed. All these different branches that exist are what's happening in the fifth dimension, and as we're constantly making our choices, we're then collapsing out only one of those branches and continuing to create something that when we look back at our physical bodies, we see this long undulating snake. And by the time a physical body gets to death, it's then embedded into something that extends right back from now back to the Big Bang as a single linear line, it looks like, in the fourth dimension.
So one of the questions and problems I've always had with the multiverse idea is that if every possibility of me basically exists in some iteration, in some timeline, then do you see that these branching universes as being actually really existing realities where there's different versions of me that are also just as real as the me choosing which path I take here? Or is there only one me, and then whatever path I don't take isn't actually manifested?
Exactly. I would say that according to what we're talking about with the David Deutsch proof, and what I'm talking about is that yes, those other universes exist, but they don't exist as being real for us anymore because, as physicists like to say, those others have been made decoherent. But that's not to say that they don't exist. It's just to say that they're not the universe that we're currently in. But I do want to make this clear, because when people get to that, they say, then what is the point of it all? If a universe exists where I decide to pick up a knife and do everybody in the neighborhood in, then why was there even any point to reality if every bad choice also exists? And for me, that's the difference between the fifth dimension and the sixth dimension. The fifth dimension being the observed reality that is created not just by the quantum level of quantum wave fields, but by our free will. So we know, each of us know in our hearts, that there are versions of us where we're never going to do that. Hopefully. Of course, there are some people who do choose to make the bad choice, and that becomes then their reality in the fifth dimension. So it's kind of like the fifth dimension is the dividing point between the observed reality that we're all part of and the dimensions above that, which then represent the push away to the other dimensions that we're not part of. And that includes the sixth dimension, which is the top dimension for our specific universe, the special initial conditions that defined our universe then all exist simultaneously as potential in the sixth dimension, and in the seventh dimension then are a single point, a position within the multiverse where we can see that everything is locked in. And that kind of relates to the string theory idea too of how our reality is actually being created by the interaction of a three-dimensional brain and a seven-dimensional brain. But again, I don't want to say I'm explaining string theory. I'm just saying we keep coming up with these different ways that this way of imagining can be then tied into what other people are talking about.
Right. You've been keeping a very active blog, kind of expanding on your ideas, and in your most recent post you were talking about this idea that we exist in the fifth dimension.
Yeah.
And so what you're basically saying is that, yes, there's all these different multiverse possibilities, and potentia branching off at every moment. But how free will comes into play is that in the fifth dimension, we are actually choosing, what reality we create. And that from a sixth dimensional perspective, that kind of free will isn't valid anymore.
Right, and it becomes kind of like what you're talking about with the Trapholmodorians. Mm-hmm. That's quite a word, isn't it? The idea that by the time you get out to the sixth dimension, that then, even though it didn't happen, there are the versions of us and for our universe where every bad thing also happened, where Y2K, for instance, was a huge disaster, and most of us are living in caves now. That version of reality exists out there someplace in the sixth dimension. The version of reality where where Elvis got off the pills and is now touring the world with the Rolling Stones. That exists out there in the sixth dimension. But it's not part of the fifth dimensional branches that are available to us right now. And that's because of what has come before in the fourth dimension. So again, we're talking about this hierarchy of if you can keep things organized going up through the dimensions, you can see how one dimension relates to another, and how the idea that we're actually in the fifth dimension is something that physicists have been talking about for almost a century now. As I've said, you mentioned on my blog, the idea that Theodore Kaluza, way back in 1919, sent a letter to Einstein saying that we can unite the fields of gravity and light at the fifth dimension, which means our reality is being defined at the fifth dimension. And Einstein sat on that letter for a couple of years and then gave it his full endorsement. And yet, for some reason, the idea that our reality is being created at the fifth dimension isn't really part of the mainstream thoughts of the general public. It's not something that people talk about. Mm-hmm. When you get to the idea then that the higher dimensions are all curled up on themselves and impossibly tiny, we have a way to work that idea back in again, and that's the idea that our fourth dimensional line is actually being created down at what they call the Planck length, which is 10 to the minus 35 centimeters, as we're branching through these choices that we're making. And some of those choices are just random things that are happening down at the quantum level. The idea that an atom could have had a certain spin state, and that's part of what's getting collapsed out. My free will didn't affect that, but my free will does have ways to choose out here at the physical level, something that then incorporates that quantum structure as well. And that's where we see that our reality is actually being spun together at the fifth dimension by these tiny little Planck length gyrations that are happening, that we look back upon from our physical bodies and say, well, we weren't in the fifth dimension, we were in the fourth dimension. We were on this line. We're actually on this line that's being created at the fifth dimension.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the string theory idea that the higher dimensions might be curled up, impossibly small, and not necessarily infinite, vast spaces. Can you explain that?
Well, I can tell you how that relates to my idea, but this is where we get into people who say, well, this guy is not a physicist; he's a composer. Why is he even talking about string theory? So I'm approaching this from the same perspective that most people in the general public who are fans of this writing. I've read all the popular books about cosmology, and that includes string theory, but it also includes a lot of other ideas out there. But I'm not a physicist. So what we're talking about then here is my impression of how this way of imagining relates to those big ideas. But really, if you want to learn about string theory, please go talk to Brian Greene or Michio Kaku. Don't come to me for your education about that, because I don't want to be placed in a position of misleading people. But having said that, if we're talking about the fifth dimension being created one Planck length at a time down here at this impossibly tiny level of reality, then that means that our fourth dimensional line can be like somebody who's traveling on a Mobius strip. And this one of the examples that I use in my animation is that if you were imagining a two-dimensional creature who was on what they call a Mobius strip, which is a loop of paper that's been turned once on itself and then taped back together, if you're traveling on that Mobius strip, you're actually experiencing this strip as only having one side, which then means that in terms of the way of imagining it, it's a two-dimensional object. It's even though it's a piece of paper that is twisting and turning in the third dimension, if you were a two-dimensional creature traveling along that loop of paper, you would experience it as only having two dimensions, and you would get to both sides of the paper, but you would experience it from your perspective as being a linear line. So that's what we're talking about then, is something where we can experience it as a linear line here in the fourth dimension, but we're actually twisting and turning in the dimensions above. The shapes that physicists talk about then, which includes brain theory and which includes what they call the Calabi-Yau space, all those ideas then are what's happening as we're moving or being locked in by those shapes in the dimensions above. And that's how my way of imagining reality relates to the physics ideas of imagining reality.
So, if I'm getting this right, and it's been a while since I read your book, so bear with me. It's hard to maintain this view of looking at reality in mind for very long. If you're not, you've been doing it for 20 years, so it comes naturally for you.
I suppose.
So you're basically saying that where reality is really happening is the fifth dimension, which is that's where we're having this conversation right now.
Exactly.
And that the sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and even 10th dimension, if that's included in this, are actually fundamental to making this fifth dimension manifest. But in and of themselves can't necessarily be experienced in the same way as we're engaged in this reality?
Well, to the extent that we're physical creatures, yes. But, of course, we're also talking about us as being creatures with a consciousness. And we're talking about that consciousness being part of other ways of organizing the data that is our reality that indicate preferences for right or wrong, for creation over destruction, for creativity over repression. All those things then are where I get into the much more metaphysical ways of embedding what we're talking about here together to say, if information equals reality, which is a quantum mechanics idea of looking at reality, if that's really true, then all of the other things that are happening here for us as spiritual creatures and as creatures with a consciousness has to be part of that. And that has to be part of the way that things are organized together.
Okay. I think we should go slowly just because it's hard to really keep in mind this way of looking at reality. But if where the action's at is in the fifth dimension, and that's where we are now, and free will is us guiding our own destiny and creating an ideally better world and better individual lives, and evolving this whole process is part of what we're supposed to be doing. Where do you see that going? Because from a sixth-dimensional perspective, all potentials, both evolutionary and de-evolutionary, have already happened. And all our free will and all our decisions from that perspective are kind of irrelevant. What I'm trying to get at is a more spiritual context or orienting principle for what we're actually supposed to be doing in this fifth dimension, if you've thought about that.
Yeah. Well, again, the idea that all of the things that we would not want to have done exist as potential within the sixth dimension is to not say that we did them. It's to say that we acknowledge that the potential was there for us to do them. And for each of us, then, we know the moments when we were tempted to do the wrong thing. We know the moments when we felt that something bad happened to us that we would prefer hadn't happened to us. And each of those are examples of the push away from the reality that we would want to be in, and that's part of the potentials that are contained within the sixth dimension. So, again, the idea that if I were in the sixth dimension, I would be looking at all those simultaneously is kind of like that accepting yourself and all your faults idea. The idea that you recognize that there were moments when you had a bad thought or when you considered doing the wrong thing are part of what we're thinking about when we're looking at the potential realities that all existed within the sixth dimension. But that's not what we're in. We're in a physical reality that's being defined at the fifth dimension. So it's important to keep those two separate from each other. And it's actually one of the really impassioned discussions that has happened at the 10th Dimension Forum, which you mentioned before. If you go to 10thdimension.com/forum, there's a really active community of people there that are debating these ideas, and not all of them agree with me, which is fine. I'm just interested in the discussion of ideas. I'm not trying to force a way of thinking down people's throats, but I am interested in the fact that there are so many other connections that we can use this as a springboard to get to, and that's why it's been so fun to talk to people around the world about this. So if we are thinking then in that Slaughterhouse 5, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time, and now here we are with the 12 Thermidorians looking at the really big pictures of reality. That still has to be looked at as potential realities, and that has to be kept separate from what we're experiencing as the reality that we're really in.
Okay. And so expanding on that, let me ask some basic questions. Like, do you believe in God, for instance? And if so, how would you define that?
Well, I believe in God, but what I've come to believe in as a result of going through this experience is that what I really believe in is that there is an organizing structure to our reality that prefers the reality we're in to other realities. And what I have to acknowledge then is that some people want to look at that and say, that's not God, that's just what happened. And so what I've ended up then with is an acceptance that we're all looking at the same big picture of reality, but it's like the blind men with the elephant. They're all looking at little parts of it. They all have their own little piece of the puzzle that they bring to it. They're really all describing the same thing, but each of us has our own way of describing that big picture, and some of us don't accept a God force, but we can still then see that we're all talking about the same thing by the time we get out to this really big picture that we've arrived at.
And so you would basically ultimately identify God with the entire structure of reality.
I would say, yeah, if we're talking, it's interesting, isn't it? The whole idea of where do you place God in this is one of the most discussed issues at the 10th Dimension Forum. And so if we're saying that the 10th dimension is the unrealized potential of absolutely everything, then is that where you place God? That's one of the places you can place it, because if we're talking about God is everything, God is the ultimate part of our reality that accepts us with all our faults, then you could place him there. You could place him, her there. You could also say God's in the 7th dimension, because God is the force that organized out of all potential realities that could have existed out there. If we're talking about the multiverse idea of there's other universes that have a different value of gravity or a different speed of light or whatever that exist out there within the multiverse, something has caused us to be focused onto this one physical reality that has this locked-in space. This space-time that even as we're navigating through it in the 5th dimension, we still never navigate away from it into those other universes. So something has kept us locked in there. So do you want to say then that God is what has pushed our reality into that one rope that we can imagine going from the Big Bang to now into the end of the universe, that represents all of our decisions that are made and all of our decisions that are not made, and exists all as potential at the 7th dimension in a specific point within the multiverse, then you could say, well, maybe that's where our God is. And there are other gods then that prefer other versions of reality, that prefer destruction over creation, and so they created a universe where the force of gravity was lower, and it all exploded out, and like a 3-year-old who likes to knock over the blocks. That's where that God likes to be, because that God prefers a different version of reality. So if we're talking about the idea that information and reality are the same thing, then we're talking about our reality has been selected from all the potential versions of reality by the forces that are organized up at the highest dimensions, and with each dimension we remove some of the options. And that continues all the way down from the 10th to the 1st in my way of imagining the dimensions.
So what you just explained, like our Big Bang, this particular kind of universe originated in the 7th dimension?
Well, 7th dimension and above. If I was going to create a universe, I'd start out at the 10th dimension where absolutely every universe could exist. And that is the idea of the multiverse, or some people at the forum have called it the super multiverse. Everybody's got their own terminologies, and when you don't use somebody else's terminology, they assume you're not talking about the same thing. And so what we're also talking about here is what quantum mechanics just talks about as the indeterminate quantum fields. And some quantum physicists say we don't need anything above the 4th dimension because our reality is locked in at the 4th dimension, and the branching possibilities that we're experiencing as part of quantum mechanics are really just the available options. Once we witness one of them, we're still down here in space-time. They would say that the quantum fields that I'm talking about here don't need all those other dimensions. So again, what I'm talking about is whatever you want to call it. It's the ultimate fabric behind which everything else that we experience as physical reality exists. And to my way of thinking, that's the 10th dimension. So we start out there in the 10th dimension. Now I'm going to take one point, and I'm going to place it someplace within the highest quadrant, or the highest, I call it a triad, which is the 7th, 8th, and 9th dimension. If I was going to place it in the 9th dimension, I would be talking about just an idea, just a preference for a certain range of values that could have created physical realities, but might just be an idea that can't be expressed as a physical reality. If I place it in the 8th dimension, I'd be placing it in a field that could encompass multiple versions of reality or oscillating values for reality. That's not the universe we're in. So in our universe, we're being placed in a universe where the defined structure constants don't change, where gravity and the speed of light and the forces of electromagnetism and all that don't change. So what we're talking about then is our universe as a point in the 7th dimension. But that 7th dimension position that we're talking about then just is identifying it as being, that's a part of reality where things don't change. A point in the 7th dimension defines a universe in the dimensions below, from 6 down to 1, as being a universe where the defined structure constants don't change. So to that extent, it's also a point in the 8th dimension, and it's a point in the 9th dimension. It's a point that doesn't change. So I'm creating a universe now. Mm-hmm. What is it about that 7th dimension point that I've defined? Well, I've defined a value for gravity, because gravity is one of the forces that physicists tell us exist across all dimensions. So by the time I've defined a very specific point, I've defined a value for gravity. And then I've also got to decide how I want to experience the dimensions below. And what we're talking about then is the speed of light. The speed of light is how we experience the reality physically. And the combination of gravity and the speed of light are really the two basic things about any universe that we're trying to imagine, that if we change those values, we end up in a different universe. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about then for our universe is a fourth dimensional line that we perceive as being continuous, but it's actually being created one Planck length at a time, one unit of Planck time at a time, and each of those is what we can think of as a dot on a fourth dimensional line that is being constructed at the fifth dimension by the branching choices, one frame at a time. And so, as with a movie, we're watching a movie at 24 frames per second. When we're watching the universe being created as we travel down our fourth dimension line, it's being created one Planck length at a time, and that's defined by the speed of light and the fact that we can't look at anything smaller than those frames, because then we are looking between the frames. We're looking back out at the 10th dimension to the indeterminate quantum field, which is everything behind what we're creating. So that's how we know that the universe we're in is being organized in that way. But if we're talking about a way of imagining, we could create other universes that have a value for gravity that goes up and down, or gradually gets stronger, or and so on. All the basic structures could be organized in different ways. Admittedly, any universe that you're talking about that adjusts those is probably not going to be nearly as stable as the universe we're in. But if you were an organizing force that liked to break things, that'd be the universe you'd want to create.
Wow. That was a pretty clear explanation, probably the clearest I've ever heard of some of these ideas. One thing that you might be able to just speculate on is, do you see there's any kind of inherent purpose or some kind of vast overriding teleology or direction to the entire process, all 10 dimensions?
Yeah, I do, but this gets into, again, everybody brings their own little piece of the puzzle to the party, and I have to accept that some people say that there ultimately is no purpose to what we're talking about here. It could be just what is. So for me, I think Gavin Gyorbrand and his book Everything Forever: Learning to See Timelessness has really come up with the best explanation that I've seen for where we're heading, which is that ultimately, when we get to the end of our universe, we're at a version where everything that could have happened and did happen and didn't happen gets folded back together into an absolute zero, where we're back not at a meaningless entropy heat death. We're at a place where we can again see what was good, what was bad, what was positive, what was negative. Everything gets folded back together, and that's the end that we're ultimately heading towards.
So all 10 dimensions would be in service of that fifth dimensional.
Exactly. That's where we were before our universe started, and that's where our universe will end up when it's done. And that's different from the heat death that has been portrayed as the end of our universe, where basically it ends up in this sad kind of death. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an unfolding back together that's actually a very optimistic feeling, because it's the idea that then our universe becomes part of the gigantic whole, the gigantic image that you're holding in your mind by the time you've gotten to this way of imagining the dimensions.
Are you familiar with Teilhard de Chardin and his idea of the omega point?
I wasn't until your article, but yes, I've read a little about that, and yes, it seems like that's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. He obviously he was a Christian and saw that as a way to reconcile some of the, basically an evolutionary cosmic view with Christianity.
That does remind me, Tom. One of the ideas that I've played with then in my mind as I was thinking about how to make a universe there. We were just working through that idea. You talk about ancient spirituality and how some of the ideas that people have been talking about for millennia may all be part of an intuitive understanding of what we're now heading to as an understanding of the really big picture. When you say, I want to create a universe, I'm going to start out in a formless void, and then I'm going to say, let there be light. That's kind of what I just did there, but I didn't say it that way. I put it into a different context, but it's kind of the same idea, isn't it?
Right.
We define, here's where we want to be out of all possible realities. This is the reality I'm going to create, and then we're going to define a speed of light that defines how that reality is experienced, and there's the beginning of a universe.
Wow, it's fascinating. And that's the kind of thing, like on the forum discussions, people are looking at Buddhism, Kabbalah, as you mentioned, and pretty much everything else, and finding striking parallels with what you're presenting.
It also seems like what's happened then is a meme, a new way of thinking, which is what I called it on purpose, because memes, as being ways that ideas are communicated across time and space, are unstoppable. And as more and more people are watching the animation, more and more people around the world are starting to, it's like a little light bulb is going off in their head, and they're going, wait, that kind of introduced me to a new way of thinking that is useful to me personally. And the increased traffic that's happening to the website and the increased interest that's happening with this project, I think, are because we're approaching a tipping point where more and more people are starting to wake up, are starting to realize that we're part of something much larger.
That's great. And your book is available on your website and Amazon as well?
Yeah, and it's also something that has happened just in the last month is we're also offering it as a downloadable PDF. We're also offering the Flash animation that is what has basically created the interest in this project to begin with, because that animation was a way in to imagining these ideas that only required somebody to invest about 10 minutes of their time, and by the time they've watched it a time or two, or in some cases, dozens of times. There are people who just love watching it over and over, and so we're offering that as a download as well at the 10thdimension.com site. There's a digital item store that people can go to, or if people are interested in T-shirts or the songs that are associated with the project.
I enjoy your songs.
Well, thank you.
Have you even considered writing another book, or what's next for the project as a whole?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I would like to spend a lot more time talking about is the nature of creativity and the nature of how this way of imagining shows us how intuition and inspiration and ideas that are connected across time and space, which is the Richard Dawkins idea of memes, are very intrinsic to what we're talking about here. And that's the next thing I want to spend a lot more time talking about, because I think that's the thing that I think really fascinating about this way of imagining the dimensions that I don't feel like I've talked about enough. The fact that it also ties into physics is important to me, because I want people to understand that this has connections to the real nature of reality. But that's why so many other people coming from their own viewpoints have also said what we're talking about here fits with my way of imagining reality, and I think that's because we're really all describing the same thing. And we all really, whether it's through intuition or through science or through ideas that are connected across time and space, ultimately there must be something behind it all that we're all trying to describe, and I'm just another guy with another little piece of the puzzle. That's my viewpoint on it.
It's a pretty comprehensive piece. Great. Well, I think that covers a lot, and I really enjoyed talking. I mean, it definitely clarified a lot in my own mind.
It's been really a pleasure talking to you, Tom. I don't get enough chance to talk to other people with your perspective, and so this has been a really great opportunity for me to be able to talk about some of those ideas a little more, and I appreciate the times where you pulled me back a little bit to talking about not just physics, but the other ideas behind it, because that's very important to me about this way of imagining reality as well.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Have a good day.
You too.